Now, this is quite a complex issue, and I want to draw our attention to a couple of main themes. First thing I want to do is to read from one of the major commentaries in this area, which is a book by a scholar called Benyon called Statutory Interpretation. I then want to make a couple of points that build on this argument. So let's look first of all at Benyon's argument about the nature of statutory interpretation. Quote, "The natural and reasonable desire that statutes should be easily understood is doomed to disappointment. Thwarted, it shifts to an equally natural and reasonable desire for efficient tools of interpretation. If statutes must be obscure, let's at least have simple devices to elucidate them. A golden rule would be best to unlock all mysteries." Alas, there is no golden rule, nor is there a mischief rule or a literal rule or any other cure-all rule of thumb. Instead, there are 1,001 interpretive criteria. Fortunately, not all of those present themselves in any one case, but those that do yield factors that the interpreter must figuratively weigh and balance. So what's Benyon saying here? Let me explain it in the following way. I think this might be one of the problems that arises when one attempts to gain an overview of this area. If one sat down and read the cases in which statutory interpretation takes place, I think, as Benyon is suggesting, one would come across fairly quickly the different practices that inform the way that judges approach the interpretation of statute. Now, some of these can be abstracted, and I will try and abstract them. But to say that there are these so-called rules, the literal rule, the golden rule, the mischief rule, which is what a lot of commentators suggest, is, I think, misleading. I don't think they're there. They're certainly not there in the majority of modern cases where statutes are interpreted, which is why I'm not really going to say anything else about them. I'm going to draw attention, though, to certain other issues that I think are important in understanding generally the practice of statutory interpretation, the kind of factors that weigh in any particular act of interpretation. And I think in so doing, we need to make a distinction, which I'm going to make in a moment, between literal and purposive interpretation. Now, the way that I want to illustrate this, first of all, is to refer to an American case. Why an American case? Well, I think it's got a particularly pithy description of the problem that we are making here. So the case is Cable and Markham, and it's Justice Hand, who says, or argues as followed. He says, "The literal sense remains the most reliable way of interpreting words, but a mature and developed jurisprudence also remembers that statutes always have some purpose or object to accomplish, whose sympathetic and imaginative discovery is the surest guide to their meaning. Purposive interpretation is an important technique of a common law judge." Right, so Justice Hand here is making this distinction between literal and purposive interpretation. I'll come back to these words in a moment, but let's just ask ourselves why we would want to make this distinction between literal and purposive interpretation in the first place. To understand the distinction, I think we need to take a step back and think, if you like, about the constitutional context of statutory interpretation, and also return to that old theme that has run through these lectures, which is the issue of judicial lawmaking. Now, what I want to suggest is that a number of myths grew up around the judicial interpretation of statute. And these myths, or these stories that are meant to explain to us what judges are doing, really privilege the idea that judges are literally interpreting statute for the following reasons. Now, remember that Parliament is meant to be the sovereign lawmaking body, and judges are meant neither to create law nor to involve themselves in politics or policy. Now, as I say, I'm saying this is largely a myth, a story that has been told about the way the Constitution works. I don't think the Constitution does work like this, and everything that I've said in these lectures obviously goes to this point. Judges do make law. So, the problem with this distinction between literal and purposive interpretation is that a purposive interpretation, or the way in which a purpose can be used to explain an act, I'll come back to that point in a minute, the problem seems to be that this involves a judge asking him or herself questions about the purpose of an act. This can involve a political or policy element. It involves a political or policy element to judicial interpretation. And from the perspective I was talking about, this would be criticised. A judge cannot involve him or herself in policy matters. Policy and politics is for Parliament. Furthermore, as judges are not lawmakers, or so the story goes, then any trespassing into lawmaking through interpretation is also illegitimate. Indeed, the assertion that the judiciary is apolitical has led to the development of the practice of literal interpretation. Literal interpretation meant that the judge had to limit their interpretive efforts to the four corners of the act. They couldn't bring anything else to the act in order to elaborate any of the problematic or ambiguous features of the act, because that would trespass into lawmaking, that would trespass into purposive interpretation, i.e. the question of the purpose or the end of the act, which meant that the judge was becoming a lawmaker, the judge was trespassing on the province of Parliament. So these terms, or the idea that the literal approach is fundamental and judges shouldn't depart from it, describe the way in which judges were meant to approach statutes. One of the problems was that judges often did express political prejudices through their interpretation of statute. The second, which is another factor that I think we need to take into account, in other words, we need to destroy this myth that literal interpretation is the only way of interpreting, or that judges don't make law. The second problem is that clearly judges have to be acknowledged as lawmakers. It was then a constitutional fiction that judges merely interpreted the law or discovered through their decisions what the common law has always been. So, I think to understand what is happening now, what the modern practice of judicial interpretation involves, requires us to understand the contemporary background of the law of the United Kingdom. I think judges have taken on a much more active role in interpretation and are much more willing to use purposive methods of interpretation. These can be linked to certain recent developments, as I just mentioned, such as the impact of European law and the impact of European human rights law. The question then can be reposed in the following way. If we see that judges are departing from the literal rule and engaging in purposive questions about what the meaning of an act or a statute or a section of a statute might be, I think what we are trying to understand is the question of the parameters of this practice. When might a judge go too far and thus become too much of a lawmaker? Or when might a judge be operating within acceptable parameters? So it's as if, to me, rather than this question of literal rules and purposive rules and mischief rules, what we need to address is the modern practice of interpretation, statutory interpretation. We also need to move away from the idea that all judges do is try and stick to the four corners of the Act, that they don't involve themselves in purposive interpretation, because I think to understand the contemporary practice, we need to see it based on purposive interpretation, and also, certainly in relation to European human rights law and to the interpretation of European law in UK law, we need to see that judges can add words into a statute, for example, interpret in a particularly broad way, issues that I'll come on to in a moment.